All right, so welcome everybody to our second session of the Adaptation Planning and Practices for Forest Carbon Management course. In this session, we are going to talk about creating a project and defining your goals and objectives. So really diving into this first step of the adaptation workbook. So our agenda for today is we're going to start off just with a real quick refresher on the adaptation workbook, and then look at an example project from some managers that we worked with using the forest carbon management menu. So kind of seeing adaptation with forest carbon management goals in mind. Like last week, we're going to take a little bit of a diversion from thinking strictly about adaptation and talk a little bit more about forest carbon management, get a little bit more into the weeds on some of those considerations of how carbon responds to disturbances and natural disturbances and management disturbances alike. Then we're going to get to work talking about step one, talking about what we need to do to really hone in on defining our goals and objectives, and really thinking, talking a little bit more about what we discussed in our discussion sessions last week about, making sure that our projects are kind of the right size, that they're not too big to be unwieldy, but not also too small that we don't have a whole lot to say about them. And then after that, Danielle's going to then kind of give us a little tour through the adaptation workbook so you can kind of see how you're going to interact with the adaptation workbook to get your step one goals and objectives completed. All right, so you've already seen this slide once before, you're probably familiar with it, but just to kind of remind us, we're here to really think about adaptation, and we're here to really intentionally address what we think are the climate change risks that are important for the projects that we're thinking about in order to meet our goals and objectives that we're defining for that project. And, this workbook process really is designed to be flexible. It's driven by you, the manager, the user, based on what you put into the workbook, your goals and objectives, what you see as the important risks. And of course, we'll be primarily using the forest carbon management menu, but if there are other menus that pertain to your goals and objectives, you can look at those other menus of adaptation strategies and approaches. So again, you're going to see this figure a lot. This is the 5 steps of the adaptation workbook, and we are of course at step number 1, which is about defining kind of our project, where we're working, but also those management goals and objectives. And next week, we will be tackling step 2, which is all about sort of assessing our climate risks, understanding sort of what are the site characteristics that make our project area more or less vulnerable, or make those risks more or less, I think, important for our goal, and kind of understanding what the vulnerability of our site is to those risks. Then we go on and evaluate our objectives given those vulnerabilities, and then we dive into using the menus in step 4, and then finally end with thinking about monitoring and how do we monitor to evaluate the effectiveness of all of these actions. And so I'm going to give you kind of an example of how all those 5 steps that I just described kind of fit into this really coherent, very nice logical train of thought to integrate climate into management planning. And so the project example I'm going to talk about in the next couple of minutes is from working with folks from the Green Mountain Audubon Center in central Vermont. And when we worked with these folks, they kind of came to this project to really try to tackle this question of, can we accomplish all of these three goals of, sort of the mission of our center, which is around bird habitat. Of course, we want to be thinking about adaptation, but then can we also see how carbon fits into all of this? So as you might have guessed, the Green Mountain Audubon Center in Audubon, Vermont is really focused on bird species habitat. And so kind of one of the primary goals for this project, which was a revision of their 10-year management plan for the Green Mountain Audubon Center. And so one of that high-level goals was to provide wildlife habitat for neotropical songbird. And this is a designated important bird area. It's a demonstration area for forestry with birds in mind. So that was really, an important goal. But then they also had goals for, production of high value saw timber. They, of course, the operations of the center kind of depends upon some of that income from saw timber production. They also do a lot of environmental education programming, and they have a sugar bush there on their site. And so they do a lot of kind of education on sugar bush management. And then, of course, they wanted to see how all this works with carbon goals as well. So maintaining high carbon stocks as well as increasing carbon sequestration. So along with these goals, they had some of these objectives, and I didn't lay this out so that you can kind of connect them like you will be doing in the adaptation workbook. But that goal of bird habitat kind of pertains to those first three objectives of maintaining high canopy cover, increasing understory diversity or understory density, and then species diversity, and then especially maintaining or even enhancing some of the softwood component in their forests. That saw timber goal, kind of was looking at, both species diversity and the hardwoods, but also, addressing beach competition and regeneration issues that kind of go along with beach competition. And then the sugar bush, again, they wanted to be thinking about regeneration and also preventing this invasive species establishment in all of these areas. So for their particular site, which was a northern hardwood site that had kind of an overstory of mature hemlock in parts of it, other parts where the sugar bush was predominantly sugar maple, they're really concerned about the impacts that are associated with warming, in particular the warming winters, which means a reduced duration of snowpack for their site, increased pressure from herbivory from deer, increased pressure from insect pests as well. As they're kind of moving northward, they're expanding their ranges with those warming winters. They're also concerned with some of the impacts that are related to the increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. So, recognizing that the disturbance that happens creates opportunities for invasive plant species to establish. They had a high wind event a number of years back, and fortunately they didn't have much in the way of wind throw, but the neighboring property did, and there was a lot of invasives that moved in when those gaps in the canopy were created. And I didn't mention, but they also have, the site is available for recreation. There's trails, and so they're concerned about erosion both on their trails, but also just in general on some of their sloped areas. They want to just minimize the impacts of soil erosion for a number of reasons. All right, so I just am highlighting some of the adaptation actions that they identified going through the adaptation workbook process. And I split them up into two slides and this is a point that we'll kind of hammer on a little bit as we go through the workbook process with you, is that, a lot of what adaptation is things that you're already planning on doing, but they just make a lot of sense, or they make even more sense given climate change. So that's what I'm showing here in this table, is these were things that they were thinking they were probably already going to be doing. And so on that left-hand side, the bolded text, that column shows the actions that they had identified. And then in the 3 columns to the right, kind of shows how that action supports their primary goal of bird habitat, how it contributes to adaptation, and then also to carbon mitigation. And so, they identified areas that they weren't going to do any harvest. They were just going to maintain these as no harvest areas. Of course, that's maintaining interior forest conditions that are important for a lot of their bird species. That also supports adaptation through just general connectivity. That's kind of the matrix of the site. And of course, for mitigation purposes, that's allowing these areas, the trees, to grow bigger. The forest retains carbon stocks in those areas. That second row, though, they did identify areas where they're going to do some harvest, and they identified that one of their primary prescriptions was around group selection and creating gaps with retaining snags. And so this does a lot for enhancing, the structural complexity and the structural heterogeneity of the property by creating these gaps and retaining the dead wood and snags. For adaptation, this, creates more structural diversity, which then benefits sort of the resilience of the stand. And from a carbon perspective, this can improve the growth of some of the remaining trees, because they were going to identify some retention trees within those large gaps. And then, creating dead wood and such, and then also regenerating young trees, young stand conditions in those gaps, then benefits sequestration rates. And then you can see in that last row as well, non-invasive species, there's, a number of benefits as well. And I'm just gonna, for time purposes, I'm gonna go on to the next slide here and just highlight that one of the new actions that they identified, this is something that they didn't plan on doing, but going through that adaptation workbook process and using the menu, they thought of some new things. And I thought one that was neat is that red oak is not a species that they'll typically manage for in this part of Vermont. This is really, a rich northern hardwood site, but they recognize that they could be promoting red oak. They could even be planting red oak in some of those gaps, and that had a value for bird habitat, because oaks support a really diverse insect population. That's a food resource for birds. From an adaptation perspective and also carbon, oaks projected to have good habitat suitability into the future, so that it provides both the opportunity for robust sequestration of carbon into the future, as well as just the adaptation benefits of having future adapted species. And then finally, the monitoring aspects really kind of look back to what those goals and objectives are. And so they identified a number of things to be looking at after implementation of this management plan. That included, of course, they're going to be doing breeding bird surveys. They're going to be looking at species diversity, regeneration. How are they doing with managing deer herbivory and beach competition and invasives? So really kind of looking toward those goals and objectives to see, were we effective in our management to be meeting those goals and objectives? So that's a quick look at the adaptation workbook process and an example of how it looks. We've got a whole host of demonstration projects that you can find on our website, so you can explore this one and a lot more. And just a reminder, if you've got questions about this or other stuff, put them in the chat. We'll get to questions after the lecture is over, but but please do put your questions in the chat. All right, so how does all this, thinking about adaptation fit in with carbon? And we started exploring this in the last lecture. We're going to talk about it a little bit more here in this lecture. It is just really, I think, kind of scratching the surface a little bit deeper this week, but there's a lot more that we can say. But I wanted to just cover a couple of additional concepts I think that are really important. And we started to hit on some of them with, I think, one of the questions that we got last week. So the first thing that is important to be considering as we're thinking about carbon and adaptation and management is just kind of putting into perspective the spatial scale of what we're doing as it relates to your project. And what does that mean kind of for the carbon in your project? And I want to emphasize that I think it's really important to be thinking not about just the carbon in sort of where you're going in and managing, but we're really trying to be thinking holistically about the carbon in your entire project area. So at a kind of a stand scale, if your project is the entire stand, maybe it's a 10-acre stand or something like that, and you're going to be going in and doing management on that entire 10 acres, well, then you're going to probably have a fairly noticeable impact on carbon dynamics because you're managing essentially the entire project area. And so that's kind of that large peak and trough, this kind of conceptual figure. It covers, I think, you can imagine a long period of time. So really you get those large peaks and troughs when you're managing the entire project area. But more often, the stand or the area where we're managing is just a piece of the whole parcel or the whole project. And if that's the case, then those peaks and troughs are muted because a lot of your parcel is not actively being managed. It's just an area of it. And then, when thinking most broadly about landscapes and in particular, some agencies or organizations may own a lot of land and so, or be managing a very large area. And so a particular stand that is being impacted by management just might be a very small proportion of that entire landscape. And if that's the case, that's where you have that kind of gray line in the middle that just has little tiny blips in it. So that's kind of putting the spatial scale of our management into perspective and what that means for carbon. Of course, the other and probably more complex aspect of carbon and carbon management is thinking temporally, right? Carbon stocks and sequestrations rates are one of those things that can change in an instant under certain types of disturbances, could change slowly under other types of disturbances. And the response then over time is typically a response that plays out over the course of decades, if not centuries, right? And so our ability to kind of manage carbon, we need to be thinking kind of generally at these very broad temporal scales. And so this figure, this cartoon is just kind of a conceptual representation, of course, you can see of a fire disturbance where, a fire happens, and this is something that is more probably associated with that photo I'm showing of the Adler fire in Yellowstone, where that's a stand replacing event. And so you have the carbon that's contained in trees, which is that kind of gray line in the middle, drops from near 100 to almost 0, right? So you lose almost all of your carbon in trees as they burn up and turn into CO2. And then over time, as the forest regenerates, then you regain that the carbon back up to nearly the same level it was before, and the same thing with your total ecosystem carbon. I'm showing some other pictures here to represent that sort of what you see or what would be portrayed in that graph is going to be very different for different types of disturbances. And so, you know, a windstorm such as what I'm showing here that took place at Hubbard Brook is going to look very different. You know, that carbon doesn't immediately disappear. It just gets transferred from live trees into dead wood. And the regrowth of that forest might look very different than following a fire, which, you know, is going to have pretty severe impacts to the soil and to regeneration rates. And then hemlock woolly adelgid, that kind of disturbance is yet going to look even different. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in the next slide after this one. But and before I talk a little bit about hemlock and show some data on hemlock and carbon, I just wanted to also mention here that, you know, that response curve, we can kind of put some numbers on it. There's some resources that are out there that I'm showing here. The Smith GTR, known widely as the Green Book, and then the updated growth and yield tables that just were published in November of last year from Chaley Hoover, kind of can inform some of what that looks like, but that's very broad. It's based on forest type groups. It's an average of FIA data that kind of covers lots of different, you know, situations. So may not be, you know, may not really represent what you could expect on your site if your site index is really high or really low, or, you know, the soils on your site, or the, you know, the stocking rates, those sorts of things. So, you know, this figure is just kind of showing that with different forest types, those responses over time from disturbance can differ significantly, and probably the site to site variability within those forest types can be just as significant. And so this is some data from a paper that came out a few years back from Adrian Finzi, looking at carbon net ecosystem productivity. So essentially the annual net change in ecosystem carbon at Harvard Forest. And there's a lot here I'm going to try to quickly walk you through, but what I really want you to look at is that big figure with the red and green and blue lines on it. Those red lines show net ecosystem productivity from a hardwood site, and the line is above zero, which means that the ecosystem is gaining carbon. So carbon inputs are greater than carbon losses or outputs from the system. So it's a net carbon sink. And you can see that line bounces around, but generally that dashed line is the average and it's going up. So this forest is becoming a stronger and stronger sink over time. You can see it dips down to zero during 2012, which was when they had the severe drought there. But it's generally maintaining a carbon sink capacity there. If we look at the blue line, that's a hemlock site. And that hemlock site was kind of tracking that same line until around 2010, when hemlock woolly adelgid became established in that stand. And look what happens after that. It kind of bounces up and then it just tanks. And that those open stars in that line show that that's when they started having very significant mortality of the hemlock. And what you can see there is right around 2014, the site turned from a carbon sink into a carbon source. And really what's driving that is those two elongated graphs at the bottom is net primary productivity. So that's just looking at kind of the carbon inputs driven by photosynthesis. In that hardwood stand, you know, it's just going up. The figure on the right-hand side is the hemlock stand, and you can see it's kind of maintaining, maybe going up a little bit, and then it starts to go down. And that's the impacts from hemlock woolly adelgid. And so really just kind of emphasizing, you know, the dynamics of carbon are really just dependent upon the disturbance. And hemlock is one of those insect pests that it takes a few years for the trees to kind of succumb to mortality. That could be anywhere from 5 years to 10 years or longer, depending upon the site. So, when we think about this in terms of carbon and carbon management, I oftentimes think about sort of what are the risks to your site and how do we manage for carbon, and what are the kind of the timescales that we're looking at in terms of that carbon management response. So I think, a lot of us probably have heard about things like extended rotations, or if you're in an uneven age system, delayed harvest entries, these sorts of things that can gain, you can gain carbon in your ecosystem. And these are things that, people are using for carbon projects, right? And so I'm just kind of generically showing what that looks like. A carbon management, such as an extended rotation, would give you an increase in carbon compared to sort of a business as usual or typical management such scenario. And this is, this is being used, and this is good. This makes a lot of sense for systems where, you're not really concerned about things like hemlock woolly adelgid. You're not really concerned about, we have a lot of fuel and in this forest, and wildfire risk is really high. For systems where you have that high risk of disturbance, whether it's a discrete disturbance like a wildfire, or kind of a more acute or chronic forest health concern like hemlock woolly adelgid or some other insect pest, with no climate change impacts, you might expect to see that system being increasing in carbon, but with that risk of that disturbance, you might anticipate, well, doing nothing would actually result in a decrease in carbon. And we are actually seeing this in some parts of the country. This is some data that were compiled by our colleague, Dave Cleaves, who used to be with the Forest Service, and he was looking at FIA data showing, and this is sort of a tale of two states here. Michigan has, you can see those blue bars are the net annual growth, and you can see, net annual growth is really high, and the mortality and removals that are shown in orange and gray are much lower. And so Michigan is, a net carbon sink here, because growth outweighs the mortality and removals. But in Colorado, it's a different situation. They've been really dealing with drought, pine beetle impacts, wildfire, and so unfortunately, the forests of Colorado have kind of become a net carbon source, because that net annual growth is not out, or annual growth is not out competing or above sort of mortality and removals. And you can see it's really driven by mortality there in Colorado. And so that's sort of this scenario where we start thinking about, okay, what kind of change in management can we look to? And that's what I'm showing here then in that green line. We could imagine in a system where there's a high risk of some kind of disturbance, that we might envision implementing a management action that has a near-term loss in carbon, that then sets the system up to be more adapted to future conditions, reduces risk into the future, so that over time, you get a net gain in carbon from reduced climate risk as that system rebounds, regrows, and is more adapted to those future conditions. And that's kind of shown in that green line as an adaptation scenario. So we got a question last week about this. Does an adaptation, represent a potential loss in carbon? And that is true, it does. And that's kind of what this is showing here. But ultimately, if carbon is an important goal, that adaptation could be done in such a way that you would realize a long-term gain. And then just the last point I want to make here is just that, there are trade-offs. There are things like ecosystem restoration actions where there is just an inherent trade-off between carbon and some other important goal that you have for your system. And there isn't sort of this long-term gain in carbon that you would expect. You're intentionally reducing carbon in your system because there's some other value that you have for your forest. And you need to make that choice. And these are figures, a figure and photos from a great paper that came out from some colleagues, Caitlin Littlefield and Tony D'Amato just published in Conservation Science and Practice, a whole look at thinking about managing for golden-winged warblers and northern hardwoods that need young forest habitat. We've got somebody here in this course thinking about pitch pine barrens, and yeah, those are systems that need to be maintained in open conditions for certain habitat characteristics for species, and so those are just inherent trade-offs. All right, so with that, I'm going to then just kind of get us thinking about the step one, and I see that there's a bunch of questions coming up in the chat. That's great. We're going to get to those towards the end. But I just want to keep things moving along. So for step one, as hopefully you've seen in the reading that we asked you to do for today, is really about defining kind of the location. What is your project? What are the time frames? Where are you working, and what are your goals and objectives for this area? And that is definitely the thing that you all are probably going to spend your most amount of time on, thinking about what are your goals and objectives and how do you get this all kind of the right size. So if hopefully you were all able to join one of our discussions last week. If not, I kind of put this out there for you all to consider, sort of thinking about what's the right size of a project. What's the Goldilocks zone where your project size is just right. It's not too big and too complex, and it's going to take a ton of your time to go through the adaptation workbook process. But what's not too small and too simplified, so that there just isn't a whole lot to say about it. And in particular, I think the too big and too complex is the bigger issue, I think, for a lot of people that struggle with trying to figure out what's not too much. So really having, a couple of management units or ecosystems that you're thinking about. It could be like, well, I have a conifer stand, and I have a lowland, hardwood forest stand that I'm thinking about, something like that. It could be based on forest type, or it could be kind of based on, some other way to describe it. It could be like, this is my sugar bush, and so I have some goals and objectives with my sugar bush, and then I have goals and objectives that relate to other areas in my project. And then for each one of these, just a couple of ecosystems or management units, then having a couple of 1 to 3 goals, and each goal having a couple of objectives. You can always go back and add more. But really, the more objectives you have, the more it really compounds the amount of work that you have to do. And for each objective, you're going to have to kind of go through and put information in. And so, if you have 12 objectives, you're going to have a lot of work on your hands to complete each step of the adaptation workbook. And so just keep that in mind. There's a trade-off here between breadth and depth. Okay, so how do you define goals to really kind of get into that Goldilocks zone? So remember, goals are big picture. They're really kind of what you want, what you're trying to do. They're meant to be kind of broad general statements, not something that you could easily quantify, but that kind of expresses sort of your desired future condition, your desired state that you're trying to achieve. Then with each goal, you have one or more objectives. So these objectives are then where you kind of get into that detailed description. Think about SMART, right? Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And you can just Google it if you want to see those terms again. But really think about, objectives that are concise, they're measurable statements that help you to describe that goal. So there's a couple of examples here. You could be thinking about stream connectivity on a river on your project. And so if that's your goal, an objective could be, well, I want to remove 3 structures that impede natural flow or create barriers in the next 15 years, right? So that's time bound, it's measurable, it's specific. Again, reducing invasive species cover. This is something a lot of people are thinking about probably. And so the objective then gets to, putting some numbers on that, reducing the area covered by buckthorn from 10% to no more than 5% in 10 years. Those are really good descriptions of objectives that relate to those particular goals. And if you can, draw those goals and objectives from existing management plans, work from what you already have. You don't need to reinvent the wheel to do this. If you just copy and paste goals and objectives from some documents that you already have for a project area, that is perfect. And so here's just another couple of examples of how this looks. And I think just for the purposes of time, I'll just kind of skip to the next slide because I want to make sure that we have time to kind of run through what this looks like in the Adaptation Workbook website and get to some questions. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Danielle, and she is going to kind of give us a run through of how this looks in the adaptationworkbook.org website.
Super. Okay. So for anyone who has, before we get there, Todd, I'm hoping that everyone has already created an account on the Adaptation Workbook. And if for some reason you have, but you haven't been, you're having an issue where you can't log in, you haven't, gotten your password reset, all of that information, just get a hold of me because I can create a new password for you really quickly. And that's not a problem. So we want to make sure that you're set up for success. Don't feel like you need to be struggling. Just email us and we can help you. Okay, go to the next slide, please. Perfect. Okay, so at this point, we're going to assume that everyone has had access to the Adaptation Workbook online platform. And we're just going to put it out there that the online Adaptation Workbook is unnecessarily challenging. So if you're going through this and you're like, this is like a learning curve for me. We're all there with you and it can be a little challenging. So definitely give yourself some time to just poke around and so you can get comfortable throughout the course. But if you're struggling, please get a hold of us and we can screen share and make this just much easier on you. Okay, so presumably you've created an account on the Adaptation Workbook. Once you've logged in, you'll go to the top of the menu bar and select My Workbook, or maybe you'll be jetted there immediately, and maybe this is the screen that you will see. When it's time to create a project after today's lecture, you will go down to, thanks Todd, you'll go down to the button that's sort of down on the bottom, so you might miss it a little. And you'll click that button and you'll see a blue drop, a blue box will appear as it's shown here. And what we want you to do is to click the, I want to create a project for the Adaptation Planning and Practices course -carbon. All of your emails should be associated to the course, but if you don't see that blue box, email me and we'll get you where you need to be. Okay, so make sure you create a project that's with the course is step 1. Step 2 is, Todd, you'll want to go up to that map and go to the map and just click it where your project is located. There are zoom buttons on that bottom right hand, so you can get really close to where you need to be, but we want you to drop that pin first, because sometimes if you fill out all of the tabular information, it won't let you create a project and you'll be stumped as to why. So first do the map, and then come down and fill out the information about your project. You know, the name of the project, all of this is for your record keeping. So you can name it whatever you want to name it. The project description can be whatever you need it to be. And you can always go back and update this information, but you can't update the map location. We can do that on the back end. We can put in new lat longs, but for the most part, it's not really going to matter. So get it pretty close to where it needs to be. It doesn't need to be perfect. Fill in the size, the ownership, and your project type, whatever you imagine it to be. For this course, you could select forest carbon management, but if you do have a recreation focused course, click recreation, whatever. It doesn't matter. Again, this is for your record keeping. You will have access to all of the same tools. Okay, next slide. All right, so then you will be plunged, you will click the button to go into the adaptation workbook, and you'll be plunged into a new environment where you have this gray panel on the left and a big white panel off to the right. One thing we want you to see, and you kind of have to see it, is that you can't interact with the workbook unless you press this up arrow. And that is to show you that there's these panels of information that we sort of want you to see. The first one being there's some course information. It'll have all of the information that's in your syllabus is there for you to access, which is pretty neat. Secondly, there's this instructions panel that will give you a little bit more information about every step, but we'll also give you a video that will help you sort of figure out how to use the tool. So if you feel like you're going to need help throughout the whole course, just go to the video first, and it might be a really helpful, really 1 minute, 2 minute tour of the step so that you can figure out and get your bearings. There's also within all of the course materials, you'll see a link for this Adaptation Workbook Cookbook, which is a series of tutorials similar to what we're showing you right now. And that's a really nice reference to be like, okay, I'm in step 3. What do I need to do? Okay, next slide. So this is that first panel that does appear. It's your course materials. Again, this is everything that's in the syllabus. So if you lose the syllabus, you've got it right at your fingertips, including the lecture login link. Okay, next one. All right, but to get rid of it, you must click the little caret. Todd went right to it because it's super irritating. You can't get rid of it unless you click that arrow. On the left, you can see where you're at. So that arrow where near Todd's cursor, that's just indicating you can go to any step you want. So once you arrive in the adaptation workbook, feel free to poke around on that menu. And but for the purposes of what we're doing now, we're going to stick with step 1. Okay, so progress summary. Once you log back out and come back into the adaptation workbook, you may say, where did I leave off? And this is a really nice dashboard that lets you know how far you have gotten in the workbook. And it's pretty intuitive. Red means you haven't done it or it's incomplete. And I think there's a green symbol that will indicate you're all good. Okay, and so the most importantly on the right here, it's showing you what your management topics are and what your goals and objectives are. Have you even put anything in? So at this point, this is what your screen should look like as well. Okay, Todd. All right. So Todd referenced really nice hints on ways that we can be thinking about tailoring our goals and our objectives. For the purposes of this course, you did have to submit a worksheet that does state your goals and objectives. So we already have a good idea of what you're trying to do. And in most cases, it's just about sort of the gut check, looking at what you've already written down, figuring out if those need to be refined in any way, like can I get more specific, should be the question that you're asking yourself. Is this goal too big? That's sort of the question. What we have integrated into the adaptation workbook are sort of, we are serving up to you a series of forest types that may be relevant to the place where you've dropped a pin. So if you're in one of our ecological regions where we've already done vulnerability assessments, when you start the workbook, you may see a laundry list of forest types. And so we want you to select one of those if that is appropriate for your project. Now, if you are not necessarily just thinking about a forest type that's on your parcel, maybe you're thinking about infrastructure or a campground, that we have an option to create a management topic. And so that would be just a free form opportunity for you to describe, this is grouse habitat, however you're thinking about it. And that will help you as you're going through each step of the workbook sort of recognize where you are on your parcel, and gives you a little bit of an opportunity to really dial in on the specifics related to that management topic or forest type. Okay, next slide. Okay, so when you are in the adaptation workbook, as I mentioned, if you drop a pin within the Midwest or Northeast, you may be served up with a laundry list of forest types and management topics as shown here. So if you're working in central hardwoods pines, maybe click that, the little plus sign, and that will add it to your property. I would say go ahead and play around with all of these features, because you can add it and then you can go over to that right side and actually remove anything that you got maybe a little overzealous in adding. That bottom button on the bottom, that's where you can add that very specific custom piece, culvert on Route 3, whatever it is, you can label it, but we're giving you that opportunity there. Now, when we're defining management topics, if we do click that button, which I say, you just click everything in this workbook so that you can see what's going on. But once you do, this pop-up will appear and it will sort of force you to interact with it. You can X out of it up at the top right, or you can dial in, what is this custom management topic? And then you can describe it in greater detail. Maybe it's a very specific tree that you're thinking about, or forest type that wasn't part of the list, or again, wildlife habitat or hemlock woolly adelgid zone or something. So whatever you want, it's there for the picking and for you to customize. Next slide. And you will see that once you create it, everything sort of appears on that right-hand panel. Now at the very bottom, there is a button for next. That is one way to interact, to go to the next step. So we've created the first layer where we're saying, okay, I'm going to talk about these topics in this course. The next layer is then diving into the specifics. Well, as part of that topic, what are your goals? What are your objectives? And so what we'll have you do is select your topic on the left-hand side, that first arrow, and then you'll go to the right panel and click the button to then complete a goal and objective set for that topic. And so it's sort of, once you click the button, it magically appears these fields for your goal 1, and then the nested objectives that relate to those goals. Gives you an opportunity to make it time bound. I think most of you already have thought about that in one way or another, but it is okay to state ongoing if it's something that's sort of happening into perpetuity. But we would like you to put some descriptor in there. If you have another set of objectives, maybe you have a large goal that has several objectives that will help you achieve that goal, you can go down to underneath that first goal set. You see where the arrow is pointing, says add objective for this goal. So you can nest many objectives under one goal, or you can create a whole nother goal set. Again, play around with all of this and just remove it. Just say test 1, 3, 4, just to see how things work. And then you can remove it and put in the information that you care about. Okay, next slide. Okay, and that's all I've got. So reach out to Todd and I if you have any questions. I'd be more than happy to walk through this with you in real time. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Danielle. Yeah, so just keep in mind, as Danielle already said multiple times, play around with it. Tool around, open things up, close things down, just kind of get comfortable with it. And again, just reiterating, if you've already got goals and objectives, please, consider using them. Just make life easy on yourself. But you're not limited to that. You can think of some additional things if you want to test out some other ideas that aren't currently in the existing management plan, for example, or something that you haven't thought a lot about, but you want to say well, I really want to test out, we don't have carbon goals in here, and of course that's kind of part of why we're here. And so you may not have those carbon goals and objectives fleshed out. And so that might be where, you need to put in a little bit more of your time and energy. And of course, goals and objectives don't need to be related to climate change. Things like, I have a goal for making my forest more resilient to climate change is sort of implied already. Think about kind of why. Why do you want why do you want your forest to be more resilient? What's the thing that you're really looking to have maintain or enhanced in your management? And then of course that time-bound piece, 10 or 20 years is, I think, a good place. It's a lot of how we approach thinking, because those are the time, that's sort of the time spans of typical management plans. So that's a good place to start, but you may have goals that relate to something in the near term, in the next 2 to 3 years or 5 years, or you might be thinking long term about, what am I leaving the next forest, or 30 years from now, or something like that. All right, and so for next time, the assignment should, I think, be pretty straightforward. It's to do step 1 of the workbook. So the adaptation workbook, there's a chapter in the forest adaptation resources that kind of describes step 1 and really goes into the details of sort of thinking about goals and objectives, a lot of which we've covered here, but it's a great reminder. So do review that step 1 instructions in the workbook, and then get into the adaptation workbook website and start tooling around and get those goals and objectives put in there. Again, it might be what you've already gotten on your project worksheets, but we do expect people will probably need to be thinking about how to shrink their project down a little bit, or maybe expand on it. There were some worksheets I saw that were just very general and needed a little bit more fleshing out. So, so that's really what you're going to be working on this week. And after you complete putting in those goals and objectives into step 1, there's going to be some homework questions that you'll need to answer. Shouldn't be a big time commitment to do those. Those are just really a way for us to kind of hear how things went for you and get you kind of thinking a little bit about that process, but it should be a pretty easy task. Because this is an important step, we do want to have folks, checking in with your instructors. So you'll have an instructor, one of us, whether it's me, Danielle, or Luke, just reaching out this week via email. And if you're feeling good about things and you feel like you've got things covered, there's no need. We're not forcing you to have a conversation with us or anything, but we do want to make sure that we're just checking in very quickly and getting kind of a pulse on how you're feeling about things. And if you do have questions, you do need to kind of talk through things a little bit, then this is a good opportunity for us to set up a time to have a phone conversation or something, or just a back and forth via email to make sure that you're not stuck and spinning your wheels on this first step. So yeah, due by next Monday. And at that time, next Monday, April 4th, man, it's already going to be April next week. That's crazy. We are going to then go into the next step of the workbook, which is, as I mentioned before, it's looking at site level characteristics to identify important climate impacts and thinking about ecosystem vulnerability. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about tree species and tree species risk as well. And then also just to note, there's going to be a bonus lecture next week. Again, it'll be recorded, so you don't need to attend if you can't. Where I'll dive into a little bit more of the details about what do these general climate change impacts mean specifically for carbon. So in the Monday lecture at this time next week at 2 p.m. Eastern, we will be kind of talking about ecosystems, vulnerability, and that sort of thing. In this bonus lecture, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper and talk a little bit about what this means specifically for carbon. All right, so we used up pretty much the full hour. So we'll end it here, and we can stay on and answer questions as needed. But if you don't have any questions, have a great week. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.